Maria Thompson's second pregnancy had been nothing short of perfect, and it was everything she and her husband, Daniel, had hoped for. From the moment they learned she was pregnant, it felt like a long-awaited dream coming true. For over a year, they had tried to conceive their second child, and after months of anxious waiting and moments of doubt, the good news finally arrived on a chilly winter afternoon. Maria had prepared a special surprise for Daniel that evening. She handed him a small gift box, and inside was a tiny pair of baby shoes and a note that read, "Baby number 2 on the way." His reaction was priceless, tears welled up in his eyes, and his face lit up with joy. He pulled Maria into his arms, unable to contain his excitement. "We're having another baby," he whispered in disbelief, as if saying it out loud would make it more real. That night, they stayed up late, talking about their future and how their family would soon grow. Their son, Liam, was just as excited about the news. At 5 years old, he had been asking for a sibling, specifically a little brother, so he could share his toys and play baseball together. Liam idolized his father, and the thought of having a younger sibling to play sports with filled him with joy. Despite his preference for a brother, Liam was simply thrilled at the idea of having a new baby in the house. Maria and Daniel had chosen to keep the baby's gender a surprise, just as they had done when Maria was pregnant with Liam. The idea of waiting to discover whether they were having a boy or a girl added an extra layer of anticipation and excitement. During one of her routine ultrasounds, the doctor asked if they wanted to know the gender, but Maria smiled and politely declined. Instead, she asked the doctor to write the gender on a piece of paper and hand it to her best friend, Emily. Emily, ever the enthusiastic party planner, took on the responsibility of organizing a gender reveal party for the family. It was to be a small and intimate gathering, with just a few close friends and relatives. Maria and Daniel hadn't gone overboard with decorations. It was a simple celebration, with pastel-colored decorations, a cake, and balloons. As the guests arrived, the excitement in the room grew. Emily had carefully prepared the big reveal, and everyone gathered around as they prepared to find out if Maria and Daniel would be welcoming a baby girl or another baby boy into the family. When the moment arrived, Maria stood by Daniel's side, holding his hand as they both stared up at the ceiling. Slowly, purple and pink balloons floated down, filling the room with color and joy. The room erupted in cheers, but no one was more emotional than Daniel. Tears streamed down his face as he hugged Maria tightly. "A girl," he whispered in awe. He kissed Maria on the forehead, then turned to Liam, who was still processing the fact that he'd have a sister instead of a brother. "We're going to have a daughter," Daniel repeated, his voice cracking with emotion. Liam, though a little disappointed at first, quickly joined in the excitement, and soon he was hugging his parents, grinning from ear to ear. Daniel was overcome with joy, and in a moment of pure happiness, he exclaimed, "I'm going to teach her to play baseball too." His words drew laughter from everyone in the room, and the atmosphere was filled with love and warmth. For Daniel, the idea of having a daughter was something he had quietly dreamed of, but never allowed himself to fully imagine. The thought of raising a little girl, teaching her to play baseball, and watching her grow into her own person filled his heart with hope and happiness. That night, as they sat together, reflecting on the day's events, Maria and Daniel held hands and talked about their future, filled with dreams of their growing family. Daniel and Maria's love story began many years earlier, during their college years. Daniel was an aspiring baseball player, and his talent had earned him a scholarship at one of the best universities in the country. At just 16 years old, he had already gained recognition as a regional champion, and there were high hopes for him to pursue a professional career in baseball. Daniel was known for his powerful hitting abilities, and his teammates often joked that he could send a ball into orbit if he wanted to. His dedication to the sport was evident, and he spent countless hours practicing, hoping to one day play in the major leagues. One sunny afternoon, during one of his regular practice sessions on campus, Daniel was preparing for a major game. As he took his position at the plate, he glanced around, scanning the small crowd of students who had gathered to watch. It was then that he noticed her, Maria, a girl he had never seen before, standing on the sidelines with a friend. Her beauty and grace immediately caught his attention, and for a split second, he lost his concentration. The pitcher threw the ball, and Daniel swung the bat. It was a perfect hit, and the ball soared through the air, but Daniel's eyes never left Maria. After the practice, Daniel couldn't resist approaching her. He introduced himself with a shy smile, feeling unusually nervous for someone who was usually so confident on the field. Maria smiled back, and their conversation flowed naturally. There was an instant connection between them, and from that moment on, they became inseparable. Their love grew stronger over time, and Daniel and Maria supported each other through the ups and downs of college life. They attended each other's events, cheered each other on, and built a foundation of trust and companionship. A year later, when Maria graduated, Daniel was by her side, proud of everything she had accomplished. During their wedding, Daniel reminisced about that fateful day at the baseball field. As he recited his vows, he couldn't help but smile as he said, "That was the best hit of my life, because it brought me you." It was a line that drew laughter and tears from their family and friends, and it perfectly captured the joy and love they shared. Unfortunately, Daniel's dreams of playing professional baseball were cut short when he suffered a shoulder injury that sidelined him for good. It was a devastating blow, but Maria's unwavering support helped him through one of the most challenging times in his life. With her encouragement, Daniel decided to pursue a new path in engineering, a field that offered him stability and a chance to continue building their future together. Even though his baseball career had ended, Daniel remained a passionate fan of the sport. He attended Red Sox games religiously, and when Liam was born, it wasn't long before the father and son were bonding over their shared love of baseball. Daniel would take Liam to games, teach him how to swing a bat, and spend hours playing catch in the backyard. For Daniel, being a father was the greatest joy in his life. Watching Liam grow, seeing his athletic abilities develop, and sharing their love for the game brought him an immense sense of pride. And now, with a daughter on the way, Daniel couldn't wait to share those same moments with her. As Maria's pregnancy progressed, everything seemed to be going perfectly. She experienced the usual symptoms of pregnancy, fatigue, nausea, and cravings, but nothing out of the ordinary. Each doctor's visit brought reassuring news, and the baby continued to grow strong and healthy. Maria and Daniel felt blessed, and they were eagerly counting down the days until they could finally hold their daughter in their arms. The nursery was coming together beautifully. Maria had spent hours meticulously choosing the perfect color palette, settling on soft pastel pinks and purples that would create a calming and cozy atmosphere for the baby. They bought a white crib adorned with a delicate lace canopy, matching dressers, and shelves filled with storybooks and toys. Every corner of the room reflected the love and care they had for their baby girl. Maria took great joy in preparing for their daughter's arrival. She spent her days folding tiny baby clothes, arranging diapers in neat rows, and rocking in the chair they had placed near the window, imagining the peaceful moments she would spend with her newborn. Daniel, too, was fully involved in the preparations. He installed a baby monitor, set up a changing station, and even assembled a toy chest filled with stuffed animals and baby blankets. Their son, Liam, had his own way of getting ready for his sister's arrival. He proudly told everyone he met that he was going to be a big brother, and he often talked to his mother's belly, telling his unborn sister all about the adventures they would have together. Maria and Daniel couldn't help but smile every time they saw him interact with the baby. It was clear that Liam was going to be an amazing big brother. The delivery was scheduled for 10 days later, and Maria felt calm and at ease. She had been through this process before with Liam, so she believed she knew what to expect. They had a plan in place, bags packed and ready for the hospital, and all the necessary items prepared for their baby's first few weeks at home. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. However, one morning during the penultimate week of her pregnancy, Maria woke up feeling a slight contraction. It was subtle at first, and she didn't think much of it. She brushed it off as just another part of late pregnancy. After all, Braxton Hicks contractions, false labor, were common during the final weeks. But as the day progressed, the contractions grew more frequent and slightly more intense. "Do you think we should go to the hospital, just to be safe?" Daniel asked, noticing the discomfort in Maria's expression. "I'm sure it's nothing serious, but it wouldn't hurt to check," Maria agreed, not wanting to take any chances. They called Maria's mother to come watch Liam, and then Daniel helped Maria into the car for the drive to the hospital. They chatted casually along the way, neither of them particularly worried. They figured they'd be home soon, after a routine checkup to ensure everything was fine. At the hospital, the medical staff greeted them with smiles, and Maria was taken to a room where they hooked her up to monitors to check both her and the baby's vitals. The initial results showed no cause for alarm, but then, without warning, Maria's water broke. It was earlier than they had expected, but again, it wasn't uncommon for babies to come a little ahead of schedule. Still, Maria started to feel increasingly uncomfortable. The contractions intensified, and she began to feel lightheaded and nauseated. She clutched her stomach, wincing in pain, but she tried to remain calm. She hadn't experienced nausea during labor with Liam, but she assumed that every pregnancy was different, so she didn't think too much of it. Then, suddenly, everything changed. Maria's vision blurred, and her body grew weak. The room seemed to spin around her as she struggled to stay conscious. Before she could even call out to Daniel, her body collapsed, and she passed out in front of the doctor. Daniel's heart dropped as he watched Maria fall. He rushed to her side, calling out her name in a panic. The nurses and doctors immediately sprang into action, but Daniel could see the concern etched on their faces. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. "What's happening to her?" Daniel demanded, his voice trembling with fear. The doctors didn't have an answer, and their uncertainty only added to Daniel's growing sense of dread. He stood frozen as the medical team surrounded Maria, frantically working to stabilize her. The once calm and controlled atmosphere of the hospital room had transformed into a whirlwind of chaos and confusion. As the doctors and nurses tried to assess the situation, Maria's heart rate began to drop, and her blood pressure plummeted to dangerously low levels. Her skin turned a pale shade of blue, and her breathing became shallow and labored. The sound of the monitors beeping urgently filled the room, and Daniel could do nothing but watch in helpless horror. For the first time in his life, Daniel felt completely powerless. He had always been someone who took control of situations, whether it was on the baseball field, in his career, or at home. But now, standing in that hospital room, watching the love of his life struggle to stay alive, he realized just how fragile everything was. After a series of frantic assessments, the doctors determined that Maria was experiencing a rare and life-threatening condition known as an amniotic fluid embolism. The condition occurs when amniotic fluid, fetal cells, or other debris enter the mother's bloodstream, triggering an allergic reaction that can lead to cardiac and respiratory failure. It's a condition so rare and sudden that even the most experienced medical professionals are often caught off guard by its onset. Daniel stood frozen in shock as the doctors explained what was happening. He had never heard of such a condition before, and the gravity of the situation hit him like a freight train. His mind raced, struggling to comprehend how something that had seemed so routine could take such a terrifying turn. Just hours ago, they were preparing for the birth of their daughter, filled with hope and excitement, and now Maria's life was hanging in the balance. The medical team immediately began resuscitation efforts, administering CPR and oxygen to keep Maria's heart and lungs functioning. Her body was connected to an array of machines, each one beeping and flashing as they monitored her vitals. The room was a flurry of activity as doctors and nurses moved quickly, communicating in urgent tones as they fought to save her life. Daniel, meanwhile, was ushered out of the room by a nurse. He didn't want to leave Maria's side, but he was in no condition to be there. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands shook uncontrollably. He paced back and forth in the hallway, his mind racing with fear and uncertainty. What if this was it? What if he lost Maria and their baby? The thought was unbearable, and yet it was a reality he couldn't escape. Please, he whispered to himself, though he wasn't sure who he was pleading with, God, the doctors, or the universe. Please let her be okay. But as the minutes ticked by, Maria's condition showed no signs of improvement. Her heart had stopped, and despite the medical team's best efforts, her body remained unresponsive. Daniel's worst nightmare was unfolding before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Eventually, the doctors made the heart-wrenching decision to declare Maria dead. It was a moment that felt both surreal and devastating. The woman who had brought so much love and joy into Daniel's life, the mother of his children, the person he had planned to grow old with, was gone. Just like that. But there was no time to grieve. The doctors were still working to save the baby, and their focus shifted entirely to delivering Maria's child. It was a race against time, and every second mattered. Daniel watched from the hallway, his heart breaking with each passing moment. He had lost Maria, but he couldn't lose their daughter too. After what felt like an eternity, the nurse came out of the operating room with news. Your daughter is alive, she said softly. She's healthy. The words brought a bittersweet wave of emotion over Daniel. He felt a deep sense of relief that his daughter had survived, but the weight of Maria's absence hung heavy in the air. He was a father again, but his heart ached with the knowledge that he would never share this moment with Maria. The nurse handed the baby to Daniel, and for the first time, he held his daughter in his arms. She was so small, so fragile, and yet so full of life. Her tiny fingers grasped at his shirt, and her cries filled the room. Daniel looked down at her, his eyes brimming with tears. In that moment, he knew exactly what he would name her. Grace, he whispered. Your name is Grace. It was a name that carried so much meaning, grace in the face of tragedy, grace in the miracle of life, and grace in the hope that somehow, against all odds, everything would be okay. Despite the overwhelming grief that weighed on his heart, Daniel wasn't ready to give up hope. Maria had been declared dead, but he refused to believe that this was the end of her story. He had seen miracles happen before, and in his heart, he knew that there was still a chance, no matter how slim, that she could come back to him. With Grace cradled in his arms, Daniel knelt on the floor of the hospital hallway, his head bowed in prayer. He wasn't a deeply religious man, but in that moment, all he could do was pray. It was a desperate, raw, and honest plea, born out of the depths of his love and fear. Please, he whispered, his voice breaking. Please don't take her from me. I need her. We need her. As he prayed, Daniel felt a presence around him. He looked up to see that family and friends had gathered in the hospital waiting room. They had come as soon as they heard the news, and now they stood together, hands clasped in solidarity, offering their prayers for Maria's recovery. It wasn't just those in the hospital who were praying. News of Maria's condition had spread quickly, and soon, social media was flooded with messages of support from friends, family, and even strangers who didn't know Maria personally but were moved by her story. People from all over the world sent their prayers and well wishes, hoping for a miracle. Daniel clung to those prayers like a lifeline. He knew that the odds were against them, but he couldn't shake the feeling that Maria wasn't ready to leave him just yet. She was a fighter, and if there was even the slightest chance that she could come back, he knew she would take it. Hours passed, and the hospital remained a blur of activity. The medical team continued their efforts to resuscitate Maria, but her condition remained critical. The doctors were honest with Daniel. They had done everything they could, but there was little hope left. If Maria did survive, she would likely never be the same. But Daniel refused to accept that. He had seen Maria overcome challenges before, and he knew that if anyone could fight their way back from the brink of death, it was her. He held on to Grace tightly, looking into her innocent eyes and making a silent promise that he would do everything in his power to bring her mother back. As the night wore on, Daniel grew exhausted. The emotional toll of the day had left him drained, but he couldn't rest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Maria, smiling, laughing, holding Liam, and preparing for the arrival of their daughter. He couldn't bear the thought of losing her, not like this. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, a doctor emerged from the ICU. There was a flicker of hope in his eyes as he approached Daniel. "She's responding," the doctor said softly. "Her heart is beating again." Daniel's breath caught in his throat. He could hardly believe what he was hearing. After hours of uncertainty and fear, there was finally a glimmer of hope. The doctor explained that Maria's heart had started beating on its own, though her condition remained critical. She had been moved to the ICU, where they were closely monitoring her vitals. It was too early to know if she would fully recover, but for the first time in hours, there was a reason to hope. Daniel felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he knew that the fight wasn't over. Maria still had a long road ahead of her, and her survival was far from guaranteed. But for the first time, he allowed himself to believe that there was a chance she could come back to them. With Grace still in his arms, Daniel knelt once more, this time offering a prayer of gratitude. He didn't know what the future held, but for now, he was thankful for the glimmer of hope they had been given. Maria was transferred to the ICU, where a team of doctors and nurses worked tirelessly to stabilize her condition. Her heart had started beating again, but her body remained fragile, and there were still many risks ahead. The doctors warned Daniel that while Maria had made it through the initial crisis, her condition was still critical, and she was far from being out of danger. As the hours passed, Maria's vital signs fluctuated. Her heart rate dropped, and her blood pressure continued to plummet. The medical team performed 2 blood transfusions in an attempt to stabilize her, but it seemed as though her body was losing the fight. For Daniel, the next few hours were some of the longest of his life. He sat by Maria's bedside, holding her hand and whispering words of encouragement. He knew that she couldn't hear him, but he hoped that somehow, on some level, she knew that he was there. "Come back to us," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Grace is waiting for you. We all are." Despite the doctor's best efforts, Maria's condition continued to deteriorate. Her lungs were struggling to function, and she was placed on a ventilator to help her breathe. The machines beeped and whirred around her, monitoring every beat of her heart and every breath she took. Just when it seemed like there was no hope left, one of the doctors made a critical discovery. During the initial surgery, one of Maria's organs had been nicked, causing internal bleeding that had gone unnoticed until now. The discovery was a turning point. If they could stop the bleeding, they might be able to stabilize her condition. Maria was immediately prepped for another surgery, this time at a different hospital that was better equipped to handle her condition. The medical team used an extracorporeal membrane oxygenation (ECMO) machine to restore her heart and lung function, giving her body a chance to heal. Before the surgery, Daniel was allowed to visit Maria in the ICU. He brought Grace with him, and for the first time since her birth, Maria was able to hold her daughter in her arms. Though she was still weak and barely conscious, the moment was enough to reignite her fighting spirit. As Daniel placed Grace in Maria's arms, a single tear slipped down Maria's cheek. It was a small but significant sign that she was still fighting, that she hadn't given up. "My love, her name is Grace," Daniel whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "Our daughter is here, and she's healthy. We're waiting for you." Maria's eyes fluttered open, and though she was too weak to speak, the look in her eyes said everything. She wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. The surgery was a success. Slowly but surely, Maria's body began to recover. The doctors were amazed by her progress, and within 24 hours, Maria was able to breathe on her own again. The ventilator was removed, and though she was still weak, she was awake and aware of her surroundings. It was nothing short of a miracle. When Daniel, Liam, and Grace visited Maria in the hospital after her recovery, it was a moment of pure joy and relief. The family had been through an unimaginable ordeal, but they had come out the other side together. Maria held Grace close, tears streaming down her face as she finally met her daughter properly for the first time. "She's beautiful," Maria whispered, her voice filled with awe as she gazed at her newborn daughter. "She's perfect." Daniel sat beside Maria, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. It was a moment he had feared would never come, but now that it was here, he couldn't hold back the flood of emotions. He reached out and took Maria's hand, squeezing it gently as he whispered, "We made it." Liam, who had been waiting patiently to meet his baby sister, climbed up onto the bed beside his mother. He gazed down at Grace, his eyes wide with wonder. "She's so tiny," he whispered, careful not to disturb the baby. Maria smiled and stroked Liam's hair. "You're going to be the best big brother," she said softly. The room was filled with a sense of peace and healing, a stark contrast to the chaos and fear that had gripped them just days earlier. The journey had been long and difficult, but now, as they sat together as a family, it all felt worth it. Over the next few days, Maria continued to recover, gaining strength with each passing hour. The doctors were amazed by her progress, calling it nothing short of a miracle. Maria had defied the odds, surviving a condition that had claimed the lives of so many others. She had been to the brink of death and back, and now she was ready to begin the next chapter of her life as a mother of two. As they prepared to leave the hospital, Daniel reflected on everything they had been through. It had been the most challenging and terrifying experience of his life, but it had also brought him closer to his family and deepened his love for Maria in ways he could never have imagined. They were stronger now, stronger as individuals, stronger as a couple, and stronger as a family. With Grace in his arms and Maria by his side, Daniel walked out of the hospital, ready to face whatever life had in store for them next. They had been tested, and they had emerged victorious, filled with hope and gratitude for the future. And in the end, that was all that mattered. If you enjoyed, please subscribe our channel.